Hi, this is Barrett Ristroff from Fairbanks, Alaska, and you're watching an excerpt from Climate Change Adaptation Strategies for and by Alaska Native Villages. Please check out my YouTube page for more video clips on this topic. In this video clip, I'm going to talk about how villages are dealing with flooding, erosion, and disasters. On their own, communities can harden, bolster, or otherwise protect critical infrastructure from floods. They can anchor fuel tanks, install culverts to improve drainage, limit building in areas that frequently flood, and put up temporary barriers prior to storms. Shaktoolik is a good example of a community taking the lead on erosion. Under the leadership of Mayor Eugene Asiksik, the city got $620,000 in grants from the Norton Sound Economic Development Corporation. They bought 2 Army surplus dump trucks, got fuel from the city, and bought gravel from Shaktoolik's corporation. They hired local workers and built a small coastal berm. With some help from sources like FEMA, communities are elevating or relocating buildings. They are protecting existing water sources from flooding or finding new water sources. As I mentioned earlier, some are participating in the National Flood Insurance Program through their cities. Community members from Gullivan explained how they've elevated their roads, which can be cheaper than building walls. A community could consider asking the military to construct erosion protection as part of the military's Innovative Readiness Training. This is a program designed to provide training while also fulfilling a community need. One thing to be cautious about is building expensive seawalls or hard armoring that may or may not be effective in the long term. It's important to consider the pros and cons. Alex Whiting, environmental coordinator from Kotzebue, described the community's experience with getting a seawall.
The seawall was helpful, but it was the demarcation point from the historic relationship people had with the shoreline of their community. There's a whole range of activities that are married to having a beach in front of your town. When that shoreline becomes a seawall, not only is it demarcation for many of those activities, but it's also a demarcation from that ancient relationship people had to the shoreline of their community, especially for the younger generation that doesn't remember having a beach as a major component of their relationship to the ocean. The reason the town is located where it is, as opposed to in the middle of the peninsula, is because of the beach and the ocean and the access and the relationship. It's a very important part of how people define themselves and relate to the environment. But the alternative was to watch your shoreline erode and your infrastructure fall into the ocean. It was like a necessary evil in some ways. It has in fact protected the adjacent road and infrastructures. At this point, it seems to be more or less be working.
In Alaska, like in most places, erosion and flooding are closely tied to disasters. Community members shared strategies with me for dealing with disasters, both before and afterwards. Communities like Gullivan have storm watchers who stay up all night at the school during a disaster so they can let the community know what's going on. Communities are practicing for emergencies by gathering in the school and participating in the National Weather Service's Storm Ready program. Some are encouraging families to have emergency kits that will last until additional resources arrive. There's often a lag time before state and federal aid comes through. It's important to think ahead to what recovery will be like after the storm or disaster is over. Carol Oliver, environmental coordinator from Gullivan, explained,
It can be helpful to have a communications plan for explaining storm damage to officials outside the villages. Sometimes the extent of damage is not apparent until the spring melt, so it is important not to state that there is no damage. the state tends to call the city mayor, who may not know what to say.
Several Alaska communities have learned the hard way how complicated it can be to recover from a disaster, even with FEMA assistance. Villages like Galena, Eagle, Allakaket, and Alatna, which were nearly destroyed by floods, can share strategies. One is to be ready to tell FEMA what your community wants to do. Often, there are no second chances to say what you want. Alatna knew that it wanted to relocate to higher ground. Their leadership was able to negotiate a 1-year time frame for rebuilding the community instead of the usual 3 years. Alatna turned down temporary housing to increase investment in their long-term housing. A community may want to have a simple village agreement or plan for disaster recovery, indicating where and how the community wants to rebuild. For example, do they want to move up on a hill? Do they want to make space for renewable energy? Eagle Village was already planning to move to nearby higher ground, so when an ice jam destroyed the village, they knew where they wanted to go. A number of communities are working to get access to a rock quarry, so they have a source of gravel ready for recovering, expanding, or relocating. It could be helpful to have a training led by experienced community members on how to build houses with support from an outside entity like Cold Climate Housing, as one elder from the interior said.
The community should find a way not to spend $400,000 on one house. Stretch money out with self-help. There is a need for more self-help. Local people used to be able to at least start housing construction even if outside help were needed to finish it. It's important to understand ways to get support for subsistence, which is normally not covered by FEMA after a disaster. It may be possible to get what's called other needs assistance from FEMA to pay for damage to subsistence infrastructure. There is a need to educate government on the cultural significance and full scope of subsistence activities and infrastructure so they understand that store-bought food is not an adequate replacement.
Thanks to my musicians and participants, and thank you for watching. I hope you'll watch more of these video clips or check out my Google Drive for written strategies.